Good morning, good afternoon. I am Ana Flávia Nogueira, Director of the Center for Innovations on New Energies, a very special partnership between São Paulo Science Foundation, FAPESP, and Shell. So today here we have a very special guest in a Cine webinars. But before introducing our speaker, I would like to inform to our community that soon we are going to launch a new series of webinars that we are calling Cine Talks. So Cine Talks is a space that we open to Cine members to share their researchers. So we are planning to start the Cine Talks in June. So please stay tuned. So follow us and here on the YouTube and also in our social media. And just one more point. If you remember, you can place your questions here through YouTube. So at the end of the talk, so we are going to display your questions. So that's it. So today we have a special guest. So he's so special that I'm going to introduce him in Portuguese. So today you have Professor Erwin Reisner. So Erwin, welcome to our Cine webinar. The reason that I'm going to introduce Erwin in Portuguese is because Erwin speaks Portuguese very well. So I know everybody knows Erwin here in our community. So Erwin, thank you for accepting our invitation. Então, o Erwin, ele recebeu o seu diploma de graduação e o seu doutorado pela Universidade de Viena, na Áustria. Ele também, onde ele passou 2 anos também depois na Universidade de Lisboa e também em Portugal, obviamente. O Erwin, ele foi pós-doc tanto no MIT, né, no Massachusetts Institute of Technology, em Boston, nos Estados Unidos, mas também o Erwin fez um pós-doutorado também na Universidade de Oxford. Após esses 2 períodos, né, de pós-doutorado, o Erwin ele se mudou, né? Hoje ele é professor de energia, Energy and Sustainability na Universidade de Cambridge, e o Erwin é fellow, né, da St. John's College. Bom, todo mundo aqui conhece o trabalho fantástico que o Erwin vem desenvolvendo nos últimos anos. Nós Erwin, a gente está bastante orgulhoso de ter você aqui, dividindo a sua experiência. Bom, o trabalho do professor Erwin em Cambridge explora todas as interfaces, tanto da biologia química, a química sintética. Ele também navega aí pela ciência de materiais, engenharia, e sempre focado, né, em processos que são solar driving, né, ou seja, são processos todos que usam a luz solar aí para produzir o que a gente chama aí dos combustíveis solares, os solar fuels. So, Erwin, after this Portuguese introduction, again, we are so proud to have you here. So the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot for the very kind introduction, Anna. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think it's better for everyone for me to speak in English, so we'll keep it that way. It's a real shame that I cannot be in Brazil, of course. I really hope to come back at some time soon. I had really great visits in the past. And of course, I know that Brazil is really at the very forefront of a lot of the renewable energy research, especially when it comes to biofuels, but surely all sorts of solar energy conversion processes, I think are of extreme interest to Brazil. And Brazil, of course, is rich of resources and promise for the future. I will start sharing my screen. Can you see my screen? Perfect. Okay, so I will be talking today about a topic which I thought is potentially most interesting for Brazil, exactly because of this context, the use of biomass and other waste products, and how they could potentially be converted into useful products using solar energy. So the title of my talk is Solar Synthesis of Fuels and Chemicals from Biomass and Plastic Waste. And I will only give a very short, brief introduction on solar fuels, because I think that the community in Cine is well aware of the idea, and then talk more about the idea or prospect of actually using waste as a resource to drive solar chemical processes. So what do we, and with we I mean not only my research group, but really a large community, a global community, want to develop? And it really is the mimicry of natural photosynthesis and a process known as artificial photosynthesis, which aims to develop this chemical process that can capture and store the energy from sunlight in a renewable fuel, a solar fuel. And one of the simplest reactions, or the prototype reaction, is solar water splitting, where you would just take an aqueous solution, you shine sunlight, and then you hope you can separate water into its elements, producing hydrogen as a fuel, and in this case also oxygen as a byproduct. So if you look at this test tube that's shown here and some bubbles coming out, it would be great if we could just have a nice photocatalyst that can take the light and split water this way. And of course, there's a lot of progress being made on this front. But maybe as a justification, why do we want to work on sunlight and fuels? So I don't think I need to make an argument for solar energy anymore. It's simply vastly abundant, and we often hear that 1 hour of sunlight would be enough to power the planet for a year in terms of energy content. So that it's really vastly abundant and readily accessible. And also particularly important is that the price of solar energy has really come down significantly. So if you just take renewable electricity produced from photovoltaics, the price decreased about 80% in the last decade. But maybe we do need a reminder that we cannot only produce electricity, because if we look at the current global power demand of about 20 terawatts, that's from 1 to 2 years ago, then electricity demand is only about 4 to 5 terawatts. And the vast majority, in this case 15 to 16 terawatts, is really for fuels, which means chemicals. So we have many interesting and great means now to produce renewable electricity from photovoltaics, wind, hydroelectric, etc., to produce electricity, but we are not particularly good to make renewable fuels on the required large global scale. So I believe really the challenge is out there to make these fuels to be able to store the energy, transport it, and use it on demand, and not only for transportation, but also to power the chemical industry. So how does the solar fuel synthesis with semiconductor colloids work? And this is a very simplified representation. So usually we use a semiconductor, and again here we just look at the particle that's irradiated by sunlight. And the semiconductor has a defined valence band and a conduction band. And when we expose it to light, an electron is promoted from this valence band to the conduction band. So we have now highly energetic electrons, and these low potential electrons can be used in combination with a catalyst to, for example, reduce protons to produce hydrogen. This would be our fuel forming step, or in chemical jargon, this would be our chemical reduction, where we make hydrogen. Since we need to source these electrons, the best way to do this on a large scale would be oxidized water. So in this case, we look now at the overall process. We photoexcite the electron in the semiconductor. The electron reduces protons to hydrogen, and the electrons are sourced from this water oxidation to oxygen, which also releases the protons that can then be used for the proton reduction step. I'll just try to get to a laser pointer here. And this is overall a thermodynamic and kinetically challenging reaction. So we see here the potential overall is negative, which means the Gibbs free energy will be highly positive. So it's an endothermic reaction, and that's also why we require the solar input. And we always need to keep in mind that we have two half reactions that are shown here at the bottom, and both of them need to be coupled. So when it comes to artificial photosynthesis, before we go to different chemical reactions, there are a few considerations that we need to take into account. So one would, for example, be that we need to work with the solar spectrum. And you can see here the spectrum on the right with light intensity on the y-axis and the wavelengths on the x-axis, and gray shows the intensity of the solar spectrum. And it really depends now on our defined semiconductor band gap, how much of the solar energy we can theoretically use. So if we have a band gap that's very large, let's say 3 to 3.5 electron volts, we can only absorb UV light. That's shown here with the laser pointer. This means it's only a very small portion of the solar energy. If we have a band gap that would be very small, we can capture more of the solar energy, but maybe we don't have enough driving force anymore to photocatalyze this water splitting reaction. This 1.3 electron volts, this 1.23 electron volts here indicates the thermodynamic potential of water splitting. So we definitely need to be more positive than this value, or higher than this value if you only have a single light absorber. So anything that will be below, for example, we cannot use or is not energetic enough for photocatalysis. What else do we need to take into account? So we need to tune the band gap according to the solar spectrum. We also need to look into kinetics. So very often these photoexcited states are very short-lived. This means the photophysics involved is very fast, pico to nanoseconds, maybe microseconds. On the other hand, depending on the catalysis can be very slow. It's often milliseconds to seconds. So we have a lot of efficiency losses because the catalysts cannot work at the time scale required with the photophysics or the photoexcited states. And that's very often why we need to separate the holes and the charges to win on lifetime to drive our catalysts. So which other chemical reactions can we photocatalyze in such a system? Essentially, it's almost endless. We can be highly creative. It just depends on the catalyst, and we can have a vast library of different chemical processes. So in this systems here now, we keep the water oxidation running to source the electrons, but instead of reducing protons, we can also think about converting carbon dioxide to carbonaceous products. Here's just one of them, carbon monoxide, that we have a particular interest in because it's a component of syngas that's heavily used in industry, but you can also think of other carbon fuels. You can think of oxygenates, hydrocarbons, and many other products that can be used as fuels, but also chemicals. And of even growing attention now is the conversion of nitrogen to produce ammonia. So nitrogen, of course, is abundant in the atmosphere, and ammonia would be an extremely useful chemical, not only for the agricultural applications as a fertilizer, but also for hydrogen storage, for example. But I will actually not talk about, or not much about, the CO2 and nitrogen fixation today. I really want to talk much more about this oxidation chemistry. And the reason why I want to talk about this oxidation chemistry is this oxidative process, taking water to oxygen, actually has some drawbacks. First of all, it's challenging. And by challenging, I mean not only thermodynamically challenging, meaning you require a lot of energy to drive this oxidation, but it's also kinetically difficult, which causes further losses in energy in the system. So there's a large community of extremely talented scientists that try to develop really nice catalysts for this 4-electron, 4-proton process, but still with cheap materials, we still require significant overpotential to drive this chemistry. But even if you were to succeed to oxidize this efficiently, oxygen is reactive. So if you think about a one-pot system where you generate oxygen in the fuel, you could have issues because very often you create reactive oxygen species that can be damaging to your process, or you also form knall gas, which is a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen that's explosive. And even if you can keep it all safe, you need to separate it afterwards. So oxygen can really be a potential troublemaker. And last but not least, oxygen, at least in normal times and on Earth, is of limited commercial value. So in such a water splitting reaction, really what produces value is the hydrogen, not so much the oxygen. And the hydrogen is still a very low cost product. This means if you want to be economically competitive, the current Department of Energy targets in the US are about $2 to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen. So you need an extremely cheap process to make this really commercially interesting. So today I would like to talk about the possibility to couple different oxidations. So can we replace the water oxidation process by different alternatives? And in particular, I will talk about waste. So just for clarification, what I do not want to say with my talk is that we should stop working on water oxidation. If you think about making fuel on a global scale, there's probably no way around water oxidation because you just need so much of your substrate. But I still believe there's a scope, at least for a niche field, that thinks about different substrates, and in particular waste, because it's also readily available. And in fact, waste mitigation is notable and also important. So how can we think about these oxidative processes? And what I plot here is just the possibility to add value to any solar fuel synthesis system via oxidation. And on the y-axis, you see scalability, and on the x-axis, you see process value. So if we think about scalability, and this just goes back straight to the point I made before, oxidizing water is extremely scalable. We have plenty of it. But if you just make oxygen, again, you don't add much to your process value. As I mentioned before, the value comes from your hydrogen. This situation could change if you start making different products like hydrogen peroxide. And indeed, there's a growing community that attempts to make hydrogen peroxide via solar fuel synthesis. And I think there's definitely an argument to do so. On the other extreme would be fine chemicals. So if we could make some fine or pharmaceuticals, as an example, from the oxidation chemistry, we could gain hugely in value. But of course, usually from a pharmaceutical product or from a cosmetic, we don't need megatons. So the scalability is quite limited. And with bulk chemicals, we would go a little bit up. We lose a bit process value. We win a bit on scalability, but still the scalability is somehow limited. And I believe that somewhere at the intersection, there's organic waste. And now we can think about mitigating organic waste. From the mitigation, I think there's already value. And then it just depends what products we want to make. If it's CO2, then also we don't add too much to the value per se. But if we can make organics, then I think we have significant scalability and quite some scope to produce organic products. And this is called photoreforming. Or when I say photoreforming today, what I then mean is the coupling of waste conversion with the generation of fuels. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to use some expensive sacrificial reagents that are often used in photocatalysis to feed your reductive chemistry, because this does not add any value and is not scalable. Okay, so this slide really summarizes the idea of today's presentation. So we want to have a photocatalytic solar process that operates with 4 components. One is the substrate, a waste polymer such as biomass or plastic. It should operate in water. Then we need this photocatalyst, again, the semiconductor particle that takes the light to take the energy from sunlight to drive the process to make hydrogen and chemicals. And of course, the sunlight, as I just mentioned, to drive the process. So it's all about making this hydrogen and co-generating chemicals via oxidation. The start in my group was really made by Moritz Kühnle and David Wakerly, who have now left the group. And they started to explore looking at biomass substrates. And again, this summarizes the idea which I laid out before already. So instead of having this water oxidation, can we just feed in biomass, oxidize it, and source then the electrons to reduce water to hydrogen? And when we talk about biomass, I think it's quite important to define the type of biomass. And we really are interested in lignocellulose. And this is for 2 reasons. One, lignocellulose is the most abundant form of biomass. So again, it's plentiful. And arguably most importantly, it's not in competition with agriculture because we cannot digest the lignocellulose. So we would only look at either biomass that cannot be used by agriculture or that's simply a waste product anyway by the food industry. But the problem, and actually the structure of lignocellulose is shown here on the bottom left, where we have the core of a crystalline cellulose of this glucose polymeric chains, the polysaccharides. Then we have the hemicellulose or xylane, which is an amorphous form of cellulose, and that's wrapped up by lignin, which is this polyphenol that's a really robust structural material. So why are we not using already this lignocellulose much more often in photocatalysis? The problem is it's really inert. As I've just said, evolution made sure this is a really robust structural materials because we don't want to have that the plants fall apart readily. And this also means it's hardly soluble. So if you think about an aqueous process, it's quite difficult to degrade it or to consume it and convert it if it's just like a rock in solution. So we need to find a way to solubilize it at least to some degree. One more point for this solar biomass reforming, so using biomass instead of water as a substrate. And I mentioned thermodynamics before. So water splitting, thermodynamically, we need at least this 1.23 electron volts. But actually, the reforming of biomass, if we just take glucose as a model, and we say we completely convert it to carbon dioxide, it's thermoneutral. In fact, the Gibbs free energy is 0. This means in our photocatalysis, the sunlight is not really used to store energy then in the product, it's just used to drive or help the kinetics of the process. This means in any case, the energy conversion efficiency is per definition always 0, because we're not really storing energy. All we are doing is we are unlocking the energy that's already in the biomass to a fuel or to a chemical. I think that's quite important to keep in mind. So thermodynamically, it's easier. Which other advantages do we have? So if we look at the overall process, and assuming, and that's important what goes into the assumption that the plant indeed grew from CO2, and we take this into account, then we release CO2, we are overall CO2 neutral, so carbon neutral. So it is indeed, it can be net 0 overall. But even much better is that this system now, if we have a closed reactor, it concentrates carbon dioxide. So this means there's in principle a possibility to capture this carbon dioxide with carbon capture and sequestration, or what I'm more interested in, utilize the CO2 in carbon capture and utilization and just convert this carbon dioxide back and make fuels. And if you can do this, if you can capture the CO2 or convert it further, then you look overall at the CO2 negative balance, because you've actually taken CO2 out of the system. And last but not least, as I already mentioned, we don't have to oxidize all the way to CO2. There's no reason why we cannot produce some bulk organics on the way, or other organics also from the reductive side. So I think it's a really rich platform to do chemistry, and which allows to go into all sorts of different organic transformations. Okay, so with the idea being set, of course, it's important to acknowledge the previous work on these topics, because we are surely not the first one thinking about this photo conversion of biomass. And in fact, the first paper goes back to 1980 by Kawai and Sakata, and they looked already at polymer streams and photodegraded them, especially cellulose. But what they used in the system was titanium dioxide with a platinum co-catalyst. So this means titanium dioxide is now your wide bandgap semiconductor that absorbs the light, and platinum is your co-catalyst to evolve the hydrogen. And what's the limitation of this system? I mentioned already wide bandgap. Titanium dioxide always requires UV irradiation, so we cannot use the visible or red spectrum of sunlight, which limits the efficiency quite dramatically. Platinum means we require expensive precious metals, and overall the conversion rates and yields were low in these systems. But still, they really triggered this field. And if you look at this nice review by Puga in 2016, you will see already more than 100 papers on this topic. But quite impressively, really starting from polymeric substrates, all of them use titanium dioxide with precious metals. So we felt there was a lot of potential to develop new light absorbers and new catalysts to enable better light absorption, to replace precious metals, and also to increase the efficiency of this process. And this is really when we started to look at the literature, and that roughly at that time, when we looked for light absorbers, we saw this paper by the Feldman group in Munich. And what they reported is that when you put cadmium sulfide in an alkaline solution, it forms this oxide hydroxide shell. And that's quite important, because this means that cadmium sulfide can be stabilized in water, and with this oxide hydroxide shell will not photocorrode. Usually with cadmium sulfide in aqueous solution, when you photoexcite it, the sulfide will be oxidized and you lose the photocatalyst, and of course the activity stops. So, and the Feldman group also showed that in fact you can actually reduce water to hydrogen using this system. So we thought, can we now use this quantum dots? So this cadmium sulfide, these are quantum dots of a size of a couple of nanometers. Can we use this to degrade some of our biomass? Because we also hoped the alkaline conditions would help hydrolyzing the cellulose into soluble fragments. And long story short, this worked. So if you look here at the hydrogen evolution rate or activity in millimoles of hydrogen per gram of catalyst per hour, you can see that cellulose, hemicellulose, and even a bit of lignin indeed could be photo-oxidized, and then the electrons sourced to make this hydrogen. So the students found this quite exciting. What they did in the office and in Cambridge, they looked for different real-world samples. They found a bit of printer paper in the blue bin, then cardboard, newspaper, in the college gardens. They found some wooden branches, I guess, and also grass or sawdust. And you can see all of this to some degrees worked in the system. And that the system is quite easy is shown by this little movie. What you can see here is this is just a test tube. Then you see a wooden stem. And then you have this yellow solution. And this yellow solution is simply from the quantum dots that are dissolved or dispersed here in this alkaline solution. And you can see that over time, I put it a bit forward, these bubbles start evolving. And these are really now bubbles from hydrogen. So slowly these quantum dots start oxidizing the wood, and the electron sourced are now used to reduce the water. And in fact, it starts bubbling faster and faster over time as the photocatalyst starts probably attaching on the wood and really starts breaking down and solubilizing more and more of the wood substrate. So it's a very simple system indeed. The only thing is here is under inert conditions, so it's not open to air. This became quite popular. So when the paper was published, we got in, or better other way around, Expo got in touch with us. It was in that year in Astana, and we were discussing the possibility of having a hands-on demonstration, and we got all very excited. So we discussed the details with the organizers. But it turned out in the end that we did not want to have children running these experiments because not only is cadmium, of course, very toxic, but also I mentioned already these alkaline conditions. And if I say alkaline conditions, very alkaline conditions indeed. So you can see the activity drops quite dramatically when we go from 10 molar KOH, which is approximately pH 15, assuming concentration equals activity, and drops then down when we go more to pH 14, almost to 0. And this, at that time, we interpreted is either due by the decomposition of our cadmium sulfide, because we're not forming this oxide hydroxide shell anymore, or the lack of solubilization or the solution of the lignocellulosic substrate. But what we still saw before we moved on from the cadmium sulfide is indeed we are not oxidizing all our substrate all the way to CO2 or carbonate, as it will be trapped in alkaline conditions. We saw quite a large amount of formate. And again, I believe this is really interesting because now we're not only producing hydrogen on the reductive side, but also formate or formic acid as a compound of value on the oxidative side. But I come back more to this oxidative chemistry later. So a quick summary on where we were 2-3 years ago on the cadmium sulfide. So I think we have made progress and extended the use of polymeric waste for visible light utilization, so decreasing the band gap of the semiconductor. There was no need for precious metals in the system. The rate and conversions was actually much better than for the titania systems. And we found already accumulation of organics that we hoped to find. So it was not oxidized all the way to CO2 as shown here in this graph. But of course, two major limitations, 10 molar KOH and also the toxic cadmium. So at that time, we started to look for better alternatives. And this was the time when Hatice and Christine worked in the lab, and they worked on a material that's known as carbon nitride. So the carbon nitride we are using is shown here. This one is produced from melamine at 550 degrees. And then there's a post-synthetic modification to introduce the cyanamide groups that are shown here that turn out to be quite important. And when it comes to carbon nitride as an organic polymeric semiconductor-like material, I really need to acknowledge the contributions by Dome and Antonietti in particular, who introduced these materials to the solar fuels community and demonstrated water splitting with them. So this really triggered a huge boom in the field, and now there are tens or possibly hundreds of research groups using this carbon nitride materials today. The particular form of carbon nitride we are using, the cyanamide functionalized carbon nitride, was developed by the group of Bettina Lodge in Stuttgart. So I mentioned already this explosion of these carbon nitrides. When we started looking at them in 2013 or so, it was already the time when there was quite a bit of activity. So I hoped to find a niche what we could still do with them. And at that time was the coupling with molecular co-catalysts. So Christine and Hatice in particular looked at the coupling of these molecular hydrogen evolution co-catalysts. What you can see here is a bis diphosphine nickel catalyst that in fact is bio-inspired by hydrogenase enzymes, and introduction of this phosphonate groups makes it soluble in water, and this turns out to be a really great catalyst to reduce protons to hydrogen in water. So as long as you're under slightly acidic conditions. And what we also found is that this material in particular is really great of oxidizing alcohols. And as an alcohol, we have here this easily oxidizable benzyl alcohol, or a methyl benzyl alcohol, that is converted to the aldehyde. And we found this really intriguing because this alcohol is really almost quantitatively consumed and selectively oxidized to the aldehyde. So this is not just a classical sacrificial system where you have a huge excess of your donor and have a mixture of products on the oxidation side. This is actually quite a small amount of alcohol that selectively oxidized to the aldehyde. And that's shown here in the plot. You see over time the product distribution, and you will see that we have hydrogen to aldehyde ratio almost 1-to-1 over time. So it's a very clean system. And we really found this is a model system here to couple organic chemistry with fuel synthesis. Again, the organic chemistry is still not the most interesting, but at least it's a starting point, and it shows the possibility to have very clean and controlled oxidations, and that are stoichiometric. But still, since we saw that these alcohols have such a high affinity to the material and that the oxidation is very clean, this triggered that we explored also this highly hydroxyl-rich biomass substrates. But what we did is these carbon nitrides are still a heterogeneous material. So in fact, it just precipitates from solution. So to keep it in solution, to be able to do photocatalysis with the lignocellulose, is we ultrasonicated it. And ultrasonication of this carbon nitride just breaks it down into smaller fragments. So they're now a couple of 100 nanometers large. And with this size, they disperse and actually stay in solution for a significant amount of time. And what we explored now is the possibility to use this carbon nitrides with our co-catalyst instead of the cadmium sulfide that I've shown you before. And indeed, the system also works. What you see here is the hydrogen evolution for different substrates. The cellulose, xylane, and lignin are the polymers. And then there are a couple of dimeric or monomeric model substrates that we also investigated. And you can see, maybe except the lignin where the activity is quite low, all of them did work and actually worked as we expected. So the better the solubility or accessibility to the semi-heterogeneous photocatalyst, the higher the activity, but still even the polymers, in fact, did operate. And notable here is that we have quite benign conditions. So this is now a phosphate buffer at pH 4.5. So it's not this pH 15 anymore, but it's fairly benign. And we're using pH 4.5 because that's roughly the optimum for our nickel catalyst. But we can also replace this nickel catalyst. So this nickel catalyst is great because the rate of activity is really high, but as it's a molecular catalyst, it will degrade after a couple of hours. But we can replace it with platinum or molybdenum sulfide as co-catalysts. And if we do so, we see that the catalyst or the interface is not as well as with the nickel, but as you could expect, the stability increases by a significant amount. So even after 6 days, it's almost linear. And after 6 days, we usually switch off the experiment because there's quite a queue of using our solar light simulators. So some other group members would get a bit upset if we block it for much longer. This also shows that we have activity now at different pH values. So the platinum in particular is a system that works over the whole range, where we have under the slightly acidic or neutral conditions given activity, which still increases though with the alkaline conditions. And again, the explanation is if we don't well pre-treat or pre-break down our polymers, the activity just suffers a bit. And with this information, I would like to introduce the last photocatalytic system now for this biomass conversion. And that's much more recent work by Dimitri here. And we investigated for quite some time this carbon nanodots in the group. So if you wonder what are carbon nanodots, they're actually some carbonaceous materials. And here you can see of a size of a couple of nanometers. And you can see a TM image here on the bottom right that shows the graphitic nature of the material. And they turned out to be really good photocatalysts. So they've been developed for the last 15 years for fluorescence application or biomedical applications, and are becoming, there's quite a growing interest now of the exploitation in photocatalysis. And there are different types of these carbon dots. I will not discuss them in much detail. Depending on the temperature, how you make them, they can either be amorphous or graphitic. So the higher the temperature, the more graphitic they get, and you can also easily dope them. But this actually brings us to the synthesis of these materials, which I personally find almost the most exciting, because you can make them from really cheap precursors by really cheap methods. So one of the prototype synthesis methods is simply from citric acid. And all you do here is you take citric acid as a single source precursor, you put it in the furnace at 180 degrees to make the amorphous carbon dots, at 320 degrees to make the graphitic carbon dots, and after some workup, you actually have your carbon dots. If you want to dope them, you just make sure, so either you use a multi-component precursor or you use a single source precursor, which I found the better approach, where you have already a covalently attached to nitrogen. And we have optimized the precursors here, and aspartic acid turned out to be a really good substrate. So if you just do the same treatment with aspartic acid, you go up to 320 degrees, you form now this graphitic nitrogen doped carbon dots. And again, this nitrogen doping will affect the light absorption properties, and in particular, the charge separation kinetics. And even better is if you actually want to make this carbon dots from waste, you can even just make them from cellulose. So in this system, what I'm going to show is you can actually use waste biomass to make the photocatalyst, and this waste-derived photocatalyst can then be used to solar convert biomass waste to make hydrogen. So it's, in terms of green chemistry or sustainable chemistry, that's probably as good as it gets. And that's what you see here. So we want to use now this carbon dots to convert this biomass to organics, and then feed this nickel catalyst with electrons to reduce protons to hydrogen. And that's what's shown here. So also here, I will not go through all the details. All I want to show here is that since now the big advantage of this carbon dots, it's not only a cheap material, but it's also homogeneous. Since the carbon dots are so small, they're like the quantum dots, they're like a dissolved or molecular solubilized catalyst. So they can approach the substrate much better and form a much better interface with the insoluble polymers. And indeed, we can degrade the cellulose, the xylane, also the lignin, but the lignin only if we work under quite dilute concentrations, because otherwise the lignin, the pulp here would block quite a bit of light. And also soluble model substrates, as you can see, we can also convert. And this here is under benign conditions, pH 6, and you can see here there's much less of a difference between the soluble model substrates and actually the polymer. And we believe that's because this homogeneous carbon dots can approach the substrate much better than this more heterogeneous carbon nitrides. And the last slide here on the biomass shows a little bit on the kinetics. This is from our really great and fruitful collaboration with James Durant. It doesn't do any justice that I really only show this one summary slide, but it still shows why we believe even difficult to oxidize substrates can be converted with carbon dots. So if you photoexcite your carbon dots, you have a photoexcited state lifetime that's actually very broad. And actually there are different phases as well of the lifetime. If you have a substrate that's easy to oxidize, so this in this case would be a soluble alcohol, for example, this photoexcited state is quite quickly quenched, and you get oxidation chemistry, and the electron is simply in the carbon dot. And this electron then is being used to transfer to the nickel catalyst, and the nickel catalyst upon 2 reductions can reduce protons to make your hydrogen. But what I find really interesting is with this one type of carbon dot, and this one is in fact from this biomass-derived carbon dot, if the substrate is not easy to oxidize, there's a second pathway, and it's an oxidative quenching pathway. So then it will actually first reduce the nickel catalyst, and then we end up with an oxidized carbon dot. And this hole in the carbon dot is very long-lived, and this case is long-lived enough now to either even transfer these holes to a donor that's difficult to oxidize, or in this case, that's insoluble. And we believe in our system, when we really start from cellulose or lignocellulose, initially we see quite a slow rate of catalysis, and that's just because we have to undergo the slow oxidative quenching mechanism. And when we have started to solubilize some of the substrates, the rate can accelerate because we can then undergo this faster kinetic pathway to this reductive quenching mechanism of the carbon dot. So it's a really versatile photocatalyst. Okay, so far so good. I've said quite a bit about biomass, but I also promised that I will show a bit of information on the conversion of plastics. But before I go into the plastic conversion, I just wanted to give a bit of a general overview. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the fact that plastic pollution is becoming a huge issue that needs to be addressed. And this slide shows quite nicely, gives an overview of the global production, use, and fate of plastics since the 50s, since really mass production of plastics. And these numbers here are in million metric tons. And the primary production until 2015 has been 8.3 billion tons. So that's probably about 9 billion tons by today, and almost all of this produced from fossil fuels. In use today, we still have about 2.5 billion tons, and recycled have only been 0.6 billion tons, with 0.1 billion tons still in use. And you can see what happened with the rest. So 4.6 billion tons have been just discarded in landfills. 0.7 billion tons have been incinerated. So here, at least, we got a bit of energy back from the heat, hopefully. But still, most of it is essentially it's a linear economy where we produce, use, and dispose. And of course, what we would like to see is a much more circular economy where we ideally mechanically recycle, and if the plastic cannot be mechanically recycled, where we chemically recycle to produce different products. And this really was the topic of Taylor Uckert. She has just defended her PhD thesis on this topic. And the idea was like for biomass. We saw plastic as a valuable resource that should not go to waste because it's rich in chemical composition, it's rich in energy, it's just derived from fossils. So it's a great platform to do chemistry. And the idea here was the same as for the biomass. We feed our photocatalyst with plastics. The plastics is being oxidized either to all the way to CO2 or hopefully organics, again to source electrons for the reduction of water to produce our hydrogen with a photocatalyst with sunlight in hopefully a benign medium. This here was our starting point. So I can now go a bit quicker because we also started again with the cadmium sulfide quantum dot. For the same reasons as before, we knew that this cadmium sulfides would be stable in alkaline conditions. And we also hoped that the plastics would indeed hydrolyze or break down in these alkaline conditions. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is again just a test tube with a slice of PET, polyethylene terephthalate. That's just a piece of a drinking bottle. And it's being covered with our cadmium sulfide photocatalyst in the alkaline conditions, and we expose it to simulated solar light. So in all of these movies, what I'm showing you, this is really real-world intensity of sunlight. This is not a laser or any artificial conditions that are not relevant. And you can see again, as we saw before, that indeed really on the plastic surface, we see that these bubbles of hydrogen are coming off. So this looked already like a really good starting point for our chemistry. Here are the results. So what we can see is that some plastics work better than others. So those that work really well, for example, is PLA, that's polylactic acid, or PET, that I've just shown you with the bottle. And they work really well because they are known as condensation polymers, which means they're polyesters. And these polyesters are highly polar, and the esters hydrolyze at least partially in the alkaline conditions. So we have a very polar substrate that probably interacts well with our photocatalyst. And since we have a solubilized substrate, even better, can actually access the photocatalyst. What does not work so well is polyurethane, for example. And what does not really work are these addition polymers like polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, at least for the moment. So what you can see here, the system is quite stable. Again, we irradiate for 6 days. This is just a PET bottle or pre-treated. Pre-treated just means here that we actually exposed it to the alkaline medium overnight before we started the photocatalysis. But in both cases, you can see actually quite linear or stable conversion. And the conversion yields in general for this biomass and plastic go roughly up to 40%. So it's quite a high conversion yield. Under relatively dilute conditions, I have to admit, but still we see very meaningful conversion. The underlying chemistry is very simple, and it's just shown here. So what you see is the PET polymer consisting of the terephthalate and the ethylene glycol units. In the alkaline conditions, it will hydrolyze. In this case, the terephthalate is not soluble, it actually precipitates mainly, and then we are left with the ethylene glycol in solution. So effectively what we're doing is, in this case, is just oxidizing the ethylene glycol in the alkaline medium. So after photocatalysis, what is interesting is we see quite a broad product distribution. So there's quite a lot of chemistry happening. Maybe first, what you see here is the isophthalate, this one. This one is not coming from a photochemical isomerization of the terephthalate. This is just present in PET as a filler. So this was just present already in the solution. So we can actually ignore this one. But all the others are really products from the oxidation of ethylene glycol. And we can see formate, we can see glycolate, ethanol, acetate, and lactate. So it's quite an interesting mix of organics, in particular organic acids. And we have confirmed this, of course, by isotopic labeling, etc. Moving forward, in the plastic system, we still rely on alkaline conditions. This means this molecular nickel catalyst I've shown you before is not an option, because this will immediately degrade under the conditions. So what we have done is now we have slightly adjusted or adapted this carbon nitride system, and we are using the cyanamide function as carbon nitride that I've shown you before with co-deposited nickel phosphide catalyst. And you can see here in the TM that we have this large carbon nitrides, and then we have these batches of this nickel phosphide, which now acts as the proton reduction catalyst to make our hydrogen. And that's a procedure adopted from Thomas and Dries, previously published. So this is how the system looks like now on a scale system. The scale by here is 5 centimeters. So we have here more than 100 milliliters of solution. And you can see this is in operation, our system with the photocatalyst and the plastics. And you can see the hydrogen yield over a couple of days in this case. And you can see here what works well is, again, esters that are as dissolved or small as possible. So microfibers, for example, from clothing are a really good substrate. But we can also use the PET bottle, and we can also use contaminated plastics. So I'm not showing any results today on food waste, but we can also show we can convert cheese, we can convert all sorts of proteins. So contaminated waste is also not an issue for the system, and the control, of course, is clean. But when I say scaling, this of course means scaling for a chemistry laboratory. But this project started in collaboration with a hydrocarbon or an oil and gas company, OMV, which is headquarters in Vienna in Austria. And they have also a firm interest in plastic conversion. And when they talk about scaling, they build such a plant as you can see here on the right. So rather than having 100 milliliters, they actually produce 100 liters of product per hour. And what they do in this re-oil facility is a thermal conversion. So that's the big competition, pyrolysis, thermal processes, whereas we operate under ambient temperature, they use heat. And in their case, they just feed plastics into their thermal reactors and they get oil out of it. So 100 kilograms of plastics produce 100 liters of oil per hour. This, of course, raises the question, what do we want to do with our quite comparably small-scale, inefficient system if the industry already produces these reactors on a massive scale? But we should keep in mind that there's not one plastics. In fact, plastics means hundreds of different polymers. And it turns out these two processes are quite complementary. Where we can convert this condensation polymer, as I mentioned before, PET, PLA, etc., this re-oil facility or most of the thermal processes work really good with addition polymers. So like PE and polyethylene and polypropylene. And also this commercial or towards commercial plants and industry often require very clean waste streams. So they really need to be cleaned beforehand, they need to be pure, whereas we can actually use all sorts of contaminated waste. So although the stage of development is very different, we still feel there's actually scope to develop solar chemistry, even when it comes to plastic recycling. And this is how the reactor development is moving forward. So we recognize as long as we cannot entirely convert all the plastics, we really need to do photocatalysis actually on a substrate, which means instead of having your particles then being stuck to the waste that you have to dispose of, what we're doing is simply now deposit the photocatalyst on sheets. And what you can see here is a glass sheet with co-deposited carbon nitride and the nickel phosphide co-catalyst. And these sheets, or panels, as we call them, can be nicely integrated in flow devices, this box here. So what we have is we just flow through the waste solution, and we shine light from one side reaching the panel, and then degrade the waste. Another big advantage is here, if the waste stream is not completely transparent, of actually mobilizing the photocatalyst on a panel and irradiating from the back where the photocatalyst hits, or where the sunlight hits first the photocatalyst before it reaches the solution, is a huge advantage, because then an opaque solution will not block the light to the photocatalyst. So we think actually flow devices and these panels, from a scaling point of view, have a real advantage, especially for solutions that are not completely transparent and are not completely converted. And as you can see here on this plot, this really works with real waste. So MSW stands for municipal solid waste. This actually is a real waste sample. And under different conditions, either in pure water, even seawater, you can see the generation of hydrogen in these systems. The activities here on plastic have resulted in a quite nice center here in Cambridge. It's known as the Cambridge Creative Circular Plastic Center, or Surplus. Feel free to have a look at the website. And what it does is actually it creates a community in Cambridge that looks at all sorts of different plastic recycling approaches, or actually all approaches that are relevant to elimination of plastic waste, I should say. So this is solar recycling is just 1 out of 10 parts, if you like, and it's a really nice community. So if we look at the names here on the departments, you can see actually how broad it is. So a work package would be on replacing synthetic plastics by cellulose-derived plastics, or really biomass-derived plastics. Then we do a lot of chemical recycling that I mentioned. This is the solar conversion. It also includes electrochemical conversion and also, let's say, 3D printing with waste plastics. Then we look a lot on plastic flows. Where does the plastic waste originate? Where does it end up? And also social behavior. So how do different communities deal with plastic waste? How is it being handled in Japan, Uruguay versus the UK? And we look at the economics and business cases for these systems as well. And of course, we hope as a community growing together and also expand and work with other institutes and countries on this issue. Okay, I think my time is slowly running up, so it's time for me to conclude. So I think the concept was is quite simple, and I hope I brought it across well enough. This means we look at waste, and this is important already from a waste mitigation point of view. So even if you do not make any products, I think there's value of mitigating this waste. Then, of course, if we can extend this to make hydrogen or any fuel, plus the generation of even more value-added chemicals, then I hope we will be able to get an economic case at some point for this chemistry. It's still very fundamental, I have to say, but at the moment we try to work out the niches and where this could really go. And in order to do so, we have actually teamed up with a couple of different unities, and this goes from students to tech transfer office to companies. We have been consulting, and we have identified a couple of potential applications or niches. And again, it's important to keep in mind the competition. So if you compare yourself to pyrolysis or thermal waste plants, then I think one advantage for us would be that we can actually deal with wet waste. So if you think about wet biomass and you need to pyrolyze it or thermally convert it, then you will have a huge energy penalty because, of course, you need to evaporate all the water first. But our process is aqueous, so this would not make any difference indeed to us. And also that we can use mixed waste that I mentioned before. So we do not need to purify. We can actually use almost any waste as it comes along. Our process, as you've seen from the test tubes, is small, or it can be small, let's put it this way. So we believe it's quite versatile in terms of scale. We don't need massive centralized facilities, which makes it potentially interesting for off-grid applications. And when it comes to off-grid applications, one application that was being discussed actually was clean cooking. So if you could make hydrogen cleanly and use this off-grid for clean cooking, could be quite interesting because, in fact, dirty cooking is a huge issue where people actually cook in the houses or huts from coke or from biomass is a massive issue and causes 3 to 4 million people dying every year. So that could be a real advantage. Then another advantage is also connected. Our gas is clean, so we are not co-producing carbon monoxide, which of course you don't want to have in cooking, but you also don't want to have it in a fuel cell. So that the hydrogen gas you're producing, we believe is clean enough to run a fuel cell directly. And this is what we want to demonstrate next, in fact, to produce enough hydrogen to power a fuel cell and do some meaningful demonstration with our chemistry. Where else could you source value? So if you cannot sell your hydrogen at the price you want, maybe someone gives you more money to remove their waste. And then, of course, as a source, clinical waste is probably where you could source the most. It's quite expensive to recycle or, in fact, eliminate or burn clinical waste. And then I criticized during my talk quite a bit the use of alkaline conditions. So what we know from techno-economics is what we certainly do not want is add potassium hydroxide to our solution. It's just far too expensive. But if our source of the cellulose or lignocellulose is already highly alkaline, this would not be an issue. And in fact, paper mills, for example, the effluents, where you get quite nice streams of cellulose, are already alkaline. So there would be potential just to use this effluent directly for our chemistry. Okay, this brings me really to the end of the talk. Of course, I need to acknowledge the people who contributed to the work. I've shown a few people already. I'm happy to have such an amazing team, which is even pushing through this COVID times now, I think, with a lot of momentum. And we also just celebrated 10 years a couple of months ago. So you can see the growth of the group from 2010 with a few people and to today. And of course, the funding sources from all over the place, UK, the European Union, and other places. And of course, I'm very grateful to be able to share my results here today. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Erwin, for this very inspiring talk. I think you have motivated lots of our students and researchers here. So I have so many questions, but let's see the audience here. I think I have a question from one of my co-PIs, yes, Professor Pablo Fernandes. He's asking about the mechanism for this increase in activity with the pH, Erwin.
Yes, so mechanistic. So mainly it's depolymerization. But as we go, so this means it's just as you get more soluble substrates, the easier it is to oxidize it. But also as you go to extreme pHs, at some point you will start deprotonating the alcohols. And if you have the O minus, it becomes easier to oxidize than the OH. So it's a combination of these two factors. That's what we believe. We have not done any detailed mechanistic investigation, but that's our interpretation.
So that's my question, because you're working at pH 10, okay, with cadmium sulfide. So what happens because your cadmium sulfides are in a solution, right?
Yeah.
So what happened? So I'm sure with pH 10, so you keep these quantum dots even like for hours of measurement.
So with the cadmium sulfide, we are more at pH 15, so it's quite extreme. And they are very stable, and they simply are so stable because they form this oxide hydroxide shell. So the sulfide is not really exposed to the solution anymore. And this makes them extremely robust. And this is why you can really use them for days without major degradation.
And also when you have, for instance, your molecular catalyst, like nickel catalyst, they're also in solution, okay?
Yeah. But with this nickel catalyst, we have to operate around pH 4 to 6. So this nickel catalyst works extremely well with this carbon dots and carbon nitride, but it does not allow us to go to this very alkaline conditions. So it's always a bit of a balance, which substrate you use, which photocatalyst and which catalyst, to match the conditions for the photocatalysis. But I think the nice demonstration with this nickel catalyst, although it's not very stable, at least it shows that we can in principle go to P9 pH, because you don't want to have a process with millions of liters at pH 15. That's quite harsh and probably something you want to ultimately avoid. But we can see the chemistry works at more benign pH as well. It's just a bit less efficient.
But it would be like more ideal to work like pH, lower pH, right?
Yeah. So ideally, you would just throw everything into water. Okay. With ideally with no buffer, with no additives.
And so another question, because we were talking about the how you plan your experiment, because I saw that picture where we have like the piece of wood inside of the beaker, right? And you have your solution of the quantum dots or whatever is in there is your photocatalyst. So the amount of substrate that you really want to degrade in order to produce hydrogen, and the amount of your photocatalyst is quite unbalanced, because I think about that you really need a lot of this photocatalyst in order to produce, like, I don't know how many moles of hydrogen.
Yeah, so of course the videos were mainly for visual aid, so that you get an so in the experiment usually we don't use just a wood stick from outside. It's very pure cellulose that we powder as much as possible. But yes, so at the moment, I mean, the main limitation if you use large amount of substrate is, as you say, is the conversion yield. So if we go a bit more dilute, up to this 40%, we can reach quite easily. But if you think about this wooden stem, it would take quite a long time to convert all of this wood into hydrogen. So this would take probably months, I would say. So it's just still not a particularly fast and efficient process.
Would be easy to do like a pre-treatment with your waste, like to solubilize your waste.
Yeah, that's what we are working on. So I think pre-treatment is actually the key for us at the moment. It's not the most exciting chemistry to look at polymer depolymerization and pre-treatments, but I think it's necessary and it's quite a focus for us.
Okay, so let Ana Flávia stop talking. So I have a question here from my one of my PhD students. So Bruno is asking about here. How can I avoid issues like catalysis, sedimentation, absorption, scattering from the waste particulates, or even the reduced mass transfer between the catalyst and your reactants?
Yeah, so for the first part with sedimentation, scattering, I think that the panels provide the best way forward for this. I mean, you still have scattering, of course, on the panels, but at least not in from the solution. And mass transfer, yeah, I mean, the mass transfer will always be an issue if you are on a substrate, of course. But we believe on the panel, because you will consume the protons ideally at the time when you produce them. So we don't think from mass transfer point of view, at least there will be a huge variation in local pH effects. So the mass transfer, I think the only mass transfer limitation you get then is really from the solubilized substrates towards the photocatalyst panel. But then again, the flow and circulation can help. So you don't just need, I mean, you can keep the solution very thin. In fact, thin, I mean, even up to millimeter thin. And then you should, your gradient for mass transfer should not be dominating, we believe. And since you're flowing this whole system as well, I think with the right convection and flow rates, you can actually adjust that. But it's a really good point, and certainly not something we have quantitatively modeled, which we should do, actually.
Okay, so we have plenty of questions here popping up in our YouTube channel. So the next question is from Elvis Cal from Cornell. He's asking about how you can make integrated unit for in situ reduction for capture CO2 and how to integrate carbon capture and conversion.
So, well, we're doing that at the moment. So if you think about a closed system, all you're doing is you're evolving your CO2 or accumulating your CO2, and then you just have to connect, instead of a proton reduction catalyst, a CO2 reduction catalyst. So it's a bit inefficient, if you like, because you go all the way and oxidize to CO2 and then reduce back. But still, it's quite a nice way, I think, to source in situ CO2 for CO2 conversion to fuels. I hope that answered the question. So it needs to be a closed system. That's probably the most important.
I have a question here from my colleague here from Unicamp, Professor Juliano Bonassin. Is asking you about, have you ever thought about the use of garbage leftover foods through hydrogen? I think it's possible.
Yeah, no, we have done that. Actually, we have a paper in Green Chemistry last year, if you're interested. We can use all sorts of food waste. It works really well. As I mentioned, from cheese, etc., proteins, meat, you name it. It gets a bit messy in the chemistry space, but I think what we have shown is you can use it as an electron donor to generate fuels. Yes, it works.
Okay, so I think next question is from João Paulo. Read here. So he's asking about the surface of this cadmium sulfide, cadmium oxide particles. So do you have detailed information about simulations or microscopy of these surfaces?
We have the best is because it's in situ, because it's more metastable layering. From Raman spectroscopy is our best evidence that we have these oxide shells. So we do have in situ Raman spectroscopy on them.
Okay.
But again, on this oxide shell, there has been previous work, so it's not we did not really find this for the first time. It was really the Feldman work that showed this in quite some depth. But from our in situ spectroscopy, we confirmed the formation of these shells.
So you stopped working with cadmium because of its toxicity, or what? What was the?
No, well, the whole project was an accident, if you like. So it goes back to Moritz in particular. His project was on decorating quantum dots with CO2 reduction catalysts, and there was a lot of excitement at some point when he decorated this cadmium sulfide with one of our CO2 reduction. Our lab really started off with semiconducting particles or electrodes and decorating with molecular co-catalysts. And in this case, really the attachment of this molecular CO2 reduction catalyst we found very difficult, and it was a really tough project and very unsuccessful in the beginning. But then there was this excitement that actually we found formate. So we thought we converted CO2 to formate from one of these CO2 reduction catalysts, but then one of the controls was also positive. And then it's really actually thanks to Moritz to not give up. I mean, so some people would just say, let's move on, doesn't work. Others just want to know what's going on. And effectively what he found is that some of this formate just came from some impurities of DMF that were still in the solution. And they just came from the quantum dot synthesis. Or in fact, we do some ligand stripping procedure. And then, so we started to look into these additives and converting them. And we found these carbon dots are really good in degrading all sorts of things. And then we just started push it to the most extreme, and we ended up at lignocellulose. But actually, yes, I think it's maybe a good message for the students. It started with a positive control, and digging into it and see what we can do from there. And the persistence of one postdoc. Yeah, that's for sure.
That's true. I think I have a question here from Antonio Otávio. So he's asking about about the products that you produce in your plastic waste oxidation.
Yeah, so that's
you don't care.
No, I do absolutely. So the questions are really good. I think it brings us to our two most important streams of research at the moment. Is the pretreatment that we discussed before, and the second one is the development of selective oxidation catalysts. So we are still struggling a bit with the plastic. So we just went back a step now and really looking at the oxidation chemistry in much more detail. I cannot tell you a very selective system at the moment. It's again work in progress. We've started on this quite recently. I think it's one of the most important issues, because I think ultimately you will source value from the oxidation chemistry. As long as it's messy, no one wants to have a mixture of different acids in solution. It makes it maybe even more difficult to recycle or to dispose of them before. What you want to have is one clean product that you can easily separate and then ideally sell at a significant price. I think that's the golden goal here. Yeah,
definitely. So Erwin, I'm going to close here the session, the webinar with some questions about this new photocatalyst based on perovskites. I know that you have that paper on Nature Chemistry when you couple your perovskite solar cell in the tunneling configuration, so they have oxidation on one side, reduction on the other side. So can you comment about to use this, for instance, any solar cells, but let's focus on perovskites to drive those reactions. And in the second question, in about the perovskites quantum dots also to be used as a photocatalyst. So
you mean driving the perovskites for this waste conversion?
Yes, and then the use of the perovskites quantum dots, not the solar cells, but the quantum dots to drive these plastic biomass reactions.
So we do quite a bit of work now on lead halide perovskites, and the reason was that we had a project that came with an encapsulation techniques, and we more or less looked for the most water sensitive or moisture sensitive substrate or a component that we could think of, which were the perovskites. And it turned out to be reasonably successful. So we can really protect these perovskites with different encapsulants. The most common now is this eutectic metal known as Field's metal. And we just dip it in solution, and we can, well, as you mentioned from this paper, we have whole systems or tandem systems where we can split water into oxygen and hydrogen, or even convert carbon dioxide into syngas. And yes, you're right. So in fact, we have a paper submitted last week that shows that we can couple this to biomass conversion. So this definitely works, and it's definitely worthwhile. I think ultimately, just a general comment, I think we need to be open and flexible when it comes to choosing our light absorbers. I mean, in the community, there was a very heated debate a few years ago. It almost feels like the field is not allowed to use PV elements. It has to be really a solid liquid interface. But I think there's just a complete repertoire of approaches. And I think one of using integrated systems where you have an encapsulated light absorber is perfectly fine. So we use it now quite a lot. It just works really well. What can I say? So as long as you can stabilize it, there's a lot of scope. To the quantum, so this means now for photoelectrodes, artificial leaf type or monolithic configurations. When it comes to quantum dots, I don't see why not. So we have looked a little bit into perovskite quantum dots. We have not really followed it up. The difficulty will be to stabilize them. So it depends on what type of perovskites. But if you look at the lead halide perovskites, then of course, if you just dip them in solution, they will just dissolve very quickly. So it's the question of protecting them somehow. Yeah. So I'd say if you can find a way to stabilize them with a nice shell structure, which should be possible, I'm an optimist, then they would of course be really interesting photocatalysts. And I think there's quite a lot of work out there already of photocatalysis with perovskites. I'm not so much familiar within the biomass conversion. I don't think they're explored much. No. But I feel it's certainly very interesting material. But of course, what you then introduce is the same problem we face with the cadmium as a toxic element. Yeah. So this is, and when it comes to separation, this is an issue. So I'm not sure about Brazil, but actually in Europe, I'm not sure where the UK stands on this at the moment, but you would be allowed to use cadmium for energy generation or solar cells. I mean, in fact, they made a big exception. Yeah. But still, you still cannot afford to having your cadmium stuck to some of your biomass that you then need to dispose of. It's impossible. Yeah. So it needs to be really insulated, and you need to prove that you know in the waste you even generate, and there's always some waste. It's just free of any toxic elements or materials.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Erwin. I think we're approaching the end of our webinar. So thank you very much. It was so great to see you here. I hope to see you soon here in Brazil. Hope next year for our annual meeting that I hope it's going to be in person, 2022. Muito obrigada. Foi prazer enorme ter você aqui com a gente hoje.
Obrigado.
Okay. Bye bye. See you later.
Bye.